Welcome to another edition of Jazz Video Guy Live. Today, my special guest is a tenor sax player from Detroit who's now living in Paris, Rick Margitza. And first, a little opening spot, and then some of Rick's music, and then we're going to come back and talk to Rick Margitza.
I'm a baby boomer, the first of the TV generation. Made my network television debut in the peanut gallery of the Howdy Doody Show. Louis Armstrong sparked my early interest in jazz. I saw him on television and in the movie The Five Pennies. I also loved telling stories, and even as a kid, had a flair for the dramatic. Between jazz and show business, New York was my mecca. And I moved there in the late 60s to attend NYU Film School. Here's a clip from my first film, Rough Ride.
That big. You know what we do? You know what we do? Work together. He and I work together. With the panels.
I worked on documentaries and industrials for a couple of years, but my interest in jazz and its creators eventually became my vocation. And so over the course of the next 20 years, I wrote hundreds of articles and liner notes. I frequently heard unforgettable music and worked on cool projects like Jazz Theater Workshop. I've been online since the mid-80s, and in '95 made my web debut with Jazz Central Station. 2 years later, I started the first jazz blog, Bird Lives, whereas the Pariah, my impassioned diatribes rallied against the injustices of the music industry.
In some quarters, I was shunned and even threatened with legal action from a record company executive.
Are you a communist? Well, what are you, one of them liberals?
We want one thing. We declare our right on this earth to be a man.
By 2000, with the arrival of Napster and file sharing, it was evident that the old school music business was about to evaporate. So like most pariahs, I exiled myself to the desert to contemplate my next move. I meditated, expanded my consciousness, and finally hatched a plot where I took my interest in jazz, my skills as a filmmaker, and my experience on the web, put them all together and became the Jazz Video Guy.
Using video on the web, my mission was clear: to save jazz from becoming invisible.
Yeah. Hello, Rick.
Brett, how you doing?
All right, man. Rick is joining us from Paris. And before we get into the program here, could you tell us something about that particular video? I believe it was recorded live in Barcelona.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite clubs in the world to play. It's called Jamboree, and I think it's a couple of years ago. I don't remember the exact date. And it's with some musicians from here. We did a small little tour. Pianist's name is Pierre de Bettman. Bass player is another expat named Daryl Hall, great bass player. And the drummer's name is Andrea Micheludi. And that's one of my favorite ballads to play, Cry Me a River.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite songs. That's once I was talking with Jimmy Heath, and he was talking about how Ben Webster always learned the lyrics of a song. Do you do that too?
Not specifically like sit down and learn them, but I just as a result of hearing them so many times, I kind of know all of the lyrics. So, but I couldn't maybe recite all of them. But yeah, it's very important to kind of know the story of the song that you're playing.
Now, Rick, you are originally from Detroit. Your dad's a classical violinist. Your grandfather was a cellist. I understand that he played on a famous recording. What was that?
Yes, well, he was also a jazz bass player. He played bass with Glenn Miller, but he played cello on the Charlie Parker with Strings album. So the cello solo, kind of the famous solo that starts out Just Friends, is actually my grandfather. It's my maternal grandmother. My maternal grandfather, sorry.
Yeah, and how did you get from Detroit to New York?
Well, it was always a dream. I guess any budding jazz musician, that's kind of the dream and the goal is to end up in New York. And I went to school at University of Miami, went to school at Berklee. Then I went to New Orleans and finished my degree there at Loyola University. And after New Orleans, I moved to New York, I think 1988 or 89.
And what was the jazz scene like in New York when you first moved there? Is it active?
It was still active. It wasn't, we of course we got there and we heard stories about the good old days, so it wasn't the glory days. But there were still quite a few clubs, and the one good thing about New York, which is still happening, is that there's so many musicians who are there to learn and maybe not even work, just to go there and kind of just be part of the scene. There's a really active scene in terms of musicians getting together and jamming at people's houses. So we were doing 4 or 5 sessions a week all around the city, and that became the nucleus of people who started working and playing more in the scene. But it was just very fertile in terms of exchanging ideas and being inspired by everything that was going on in the city.
Now, I first heard of you when you had the releases on Blue Note Records. How did that happen?
Right. Actually, it was kind of a case of not of who you know. My high school band director, his name was Jack Pearson, great musician and one of my biggest influences. His son, Matt Pearson, was one of my college roommates, and we kind of grew up in Detroit knowing each other. And he got a job at Blue Note Records as an intern. And I was still living in New Orleans at the time. And basically he called me and said, if you have a demo tape or you can put together a demo tape, get it to me and I'll make sure that Bruce Lundvall hears it, who was the president of Blue Note at the time. And Bruce heard it and said, tell him we want to sign him. And at the same time, Matt decided to send the tape to Tommy LaPuma, who was working on the Amandla record with Miles Davis at the time. So Tommy heard the record and played it for Miles, heard the demo tape, and played it for Miles over the phone. And Miles told Tommy to call me and tell me that I had a job, which was an extraordinary call to get, of course. And this is when I was still living in New Orleans, and I was getting ready to move to New York. And at the same time, Tommy said, it's a shame that you're signed to Blue Note because we would like to have you at Warner Brothers. And at that point, I had not signed the contract. So I told that to Tommy, and Tommy said, well, we would like to have you at Warner. So I was in a pretty amazing situation. Before I moved to New York, I had 2 record labels bidding for me, and I had to gig with Miles.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. So that's basically how I decided to go with Blue Note because of the history and because of Matt being there, and we ended up doing 3 records together.
Wow.
Matt produced it, and those are my first 3 records as a leader.
Well, we have a little clip of you playing with Miles. Let's take a look at that.
Okay.
So Miles hears you on the phone. Tommy LaPuma plays the music. You get the gig. Walk us through what happened after that, and we'd like to know something about Miles Davis, what it's like playing with Miles.
Okay, so like I said, I was still living in New Orleans at the time, and Tommy said Miles would also like to meet you. So I go to New York, and he had an apartment at the Essex House, which is on Central Park South. It was 2 apartments that basically were converted into one, looking straight down the center of the park. So, of course, an amazing space. And I didn't know if Miles was going to ask me to play or what the meeting was going to be like. So, of course, I was terrified. And on his door was a sign that said, "Please take off your shoes." So I stood there with my shoes and my horn in my hand for about 10 minutes before I finally had the courage to knock on the door. When I knocked on the door, he opened it and he had a smile on his face that immediately put me at ease, and it felt like I'd known him forever. And he said, well, I don't want to swear, he said, the first thing he said to me is, "Where the F did you learn how to play like that?" And I said, "Miles, I've been listening to you." So we kind of had this relaxed energy between us. He said, "Come on in." And I always remember he was wearing a pair of leather pants and no shirt. And he said, "Sit down." And he goes into this huge walk-in closet, and it took him 5 minutes. And he comes out, he says, "I have all these effing clothes, and I can't pick a shirt, or I can't find a shirt to wear." Then he looks on his desk, which was full of a bunch of different cassette tapes, and he gives me a tape, which was a gig tape from one of the concerts, and he said, "Check this out, I'll see you on stage." And basically that was it. So the next time I saw him was on stage in Stockholm, and it was with Kenny Garrett at the time. We did one gig with 2 saxophones, and that was the first encounter and the first gig.
And how long did you actually work with Miles?
It was a 6-week tour in the summer of 1989. Unfortunately, not long enough, but it lasted 6 weeks.
And in addition to Miles, you worked with another trumpet player, totally opposite, but also a fantastic musician in person, Maynard Ferguson. How did that happen, and what was that like?
Maynard was my first road gig. Growing up in Detroit and in high school, we played a lot of big band music, and that was my first dream, is playing with a big band. So my friend from Detroit named Tim Reese, a great saxophone player, was leaving the band, and he just recommended me, and that's how I got the gig with Maynard. And I remember to this day being my mother dropping me off, driving me to the bus, and meeting them, because the first gig was in Detroit, and took my suitcase and got on the bus and played. I think I was with Maynard for about a year, and it was great because there was a lot of time to practice, either before or after the gig, and he gave me a lot of space to kind of just explore, and it was my first experience of being out on the road. And when I think about it now, the conditions weren't that great. It was a lot of one-nighters, a lot of sleeping in an uncomfortable bed on the bus. But at that time, I was living my dream, so yeah, it was heaven for me.
You know, one of the things about Maynard was the way that he interacted with an audience. He got people excited. What did you learn about presenting as a musician from Maynard?
Just like you said, this idea of including the audience in what you do, and just in general, even if you were in a bad mood or didn't feel good, when you're on that stage, you're there to not only entertain, but be there for the audience and be open and give them the respect that they deserve, because they paid money and they came and they want to hear the music and they want to experience something. So I learned just that lesson was the main thing I would say, is just to be present and being generous to them.
Yeah, Maynard spent his life doing those one-night stands, driving around, playing in junior high schools, and when I was a young trumpet player, I mean, seeing him in person was just incredible. Really
Absolutely, yeah.
fantastic, and a great musician too, and just a spiritual, wonderful guy. So let's talk about your departure from the United States. Why did you move to Europe?
Well, I had been in New York for 10 years, and at that point, and at that time, like many musicians in New York, you're there. A lot of musicians had Broadway shows. I was playing in wedding bands to make a living, and the gigs you played in New York, at that time anyway for me, were kind of small little local things, so it's really hard to make a living playing creative music in New York, unless you're to the point where you're really established. And I mean, even if you're playing the Vanguard, you're playing there a couple times a year, so almost every jazz musician in New York ends up going to Europe to make a living because of all the festivals and the amount of clubs and different countries that support jazz. And I always loved Paris whenever I got a chance to go over there and play, and I had a lot of friends and great musicians who lived here. And this was, I guess, in around 2003. I always talked about moving to Paris or something I wanted to do, but the situation or opportunity never presented itself. And at this time, a friend of mine who was living in Paris called me and said, "Rick, I'm moving, and if you want, I could sign over my lease." So I had an apartment in Paris at the time, and I was asked to join a band by two French brothers, Louis and Francois Mouton. So I had a gig and an apartment, and at the same time in New York, my illegal sublet was also discovered. So I was going to have to find another place to live in New York, which is always a traumatic thing. And I had just ended a relationship with a woman, and I found myself kind of just in New York, not really being that happy at that point. So it seems like the universe gave me 3 or 4 different signs saying, you should try this. And I thought if I didn't like it, I could always move back, but I didn't want to regret not taking the chance. And 15 years later, I'm still here.
Well, in the 50s, starting in the 50s, a lot of American jazz musicians moved to Europe. Dexter Gordon, Johnny Griffin, Kenny Drew, Horace Parlan. Now, a lot of that stuff was racially motivated, obviously. They were tired of the way that African Americans are treated in the United States, and when they went to Europe, they were treated entirely differently. They said, why don't I just stay here? What is it like in the year 2020 as an American living in Paris?
Well, we could separate different aspects of it. As far as being an artist, Paris is great in itself, and France in itself, but it's also kind of the center and the hub of Europe. So it makes traveling to Germany, Spain, Holland, Belgium, Copenhagen, Sweden, Switzerland, relatively easy, especially, like I said, Germany, Spain, Belgium, because you can get on a train and within a couple hours you're in any of those countries. And each one of those countries, every one of those cities have jazz festivals and clubs. So there are many more opportunities to play creative music, just being based kind of in the center of Europe. And in France in general, there's a lot more respect. Well, not only in France, in Europe in general, but certainly in France, there is respect for the arts and artists. So I always say culture is part of their culture, as opposed to the States where, of course, Philadelphia, Chicago, the main cities, definitely there are places to play and the arts are supported. But in general, the States is not really kind of a haven for artists. And in Europe and France, you just definitely feel a different type of respect and respect for the music and for artists, like I said, in general, and more opportunities to play.
Well, you are there at a unusual time. A lot is happening. So you're an American outside the United States. what's happening in the United States look like to you right now? And you can get political. It's okay.
Well, almost everybody I talk to is kind of, to be honest, is kind of laughing at what's going on. Not now, but in general, Trump is kind of a joke to everybody. So if anything, they kind of commiserate with the fact that we're here, and they feel bad for what's going on in our country for us. So the stereotype of people in France hating Americans is definitely not true. If you're kind of in France as a tourist who doesn't pay any respect to the culture, you will get kind of what's the word I'm looking for? The Americans that they kind of dislike are the same Americans that I disliked. The fact that I can speak a little bit of the language and show respect for their culture includes us, and like I said, there's definitely support for us who are suffering as a result of what's going on in the country.
Yeah. Well, you do visit from time to time. We're going to go to something you did with a quartet. I guess you came to the Detroit Jazz Festival and played. Let's look at that and we'll talk. Yeah. Now, you played with an American rhythm section there. The first track we looked at, you played with a European rhythm section. Do you notice any difference?
Not in those particular cases. Sometimes I do. There's something about an American drummer that has a little bit of a different feel than some of the European drummers I played with. Both great, but there's just something about a New York drummer that has a little bit more of an edge to it. I would say, like I said, it really is very situational. It depends on who you're playing with. Maybe some of the bass players have a little bit more of a classical kind of approach. They come out of that maybe come out of that European classical string school. But in general, the musicians that I play with have also spent a lot of time in New York, so there's not that much of a difference, but there can be.
Yeah. Now, you got a couple projects coming out. Let's talk a little bit about that. You got a quartet recording and a big band recording. How did those come about? Who's on them, and what's the content?
Okay, the quartet record, well, I realized, and it wasn't anything that I had planned, but the last record I did, which is something I recorded almost pretty close to when I moved in Paris, was 2004 or 5, and that was the last record I've done as a leader. Just happened that way. I did a lot of records as a sideman, and of course with the Mouton Reunion Quartet. And I've had a working quartet here in Paris that is made up of a couple American musicians named Peter Giron on bass and Jeff Boudreau on drums, but they've been living in Paris for the last 20 years or so. And a French pianist named Manuel Rochman. And we've been playing together for a while, and we recorded maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and just because it's so difficult to get a label these days with the way things have changed in the record business, it kind of just sat around for a while. And I went to my parents live now in Henderson, Nevada, so near Las Vegas, and I met, through some friends over there, a man whose wife is a singer, and he is a producer, and he has a record label. And I started doing some gigs with her and recordings with her, and we were just talking about projects one day, and I said, I have a record that I've been looking to try to find a label for, and I wasn't even pitching it to him. We were just kind of talking, and he just looked at me and said, Rick, we'll do it. So the name of the label is Le Coq Records, C-O-Q, which is the rooster in French. And we ended up mixing and finishing it in the States at a studio in Las Vegas. So the recording was done, but all the post-production we did there. And that also includes a French singer and guitar player and percussion, is kind of like enhancing the quartet, just adding some little details. And that is going to be out at the end of July, and the name of that is Sacred Hearts. And it's a recording of all of my original music. It's always difficult to describe, but I would say it's kind of a cross between Pat Metheny and John Coltrane, which is a pretty odd combination, but it's singable melodies, and but with intense improvisation. We have to try to describe it in one sentence. And then the other record is a record of my big band music. I went to school at the University of Miami, and I went down there to do a master class. And one of my friends, who's now the bass professor at the University of Miami, his name is Chuck Bajeron. He has a big band called the South Florida Jazz Orchestra, which is made up of some teachers from the school and some professionals from around the city. And the idea was for me to go down there and be a guest on their upcoming big band record. And I sent a couple of my charts ahead of time, and Chuck listened to them and said, why don't we do the whole record of your music? So I got really lucky in the sense that I got a big band record basically done without having to pay for it.
Wow.
And So that's going to be out in September, and it's on Summit Records, and the name of that one is called Cheap Thrills.
Cheap Thrills?
Cheap Thrills.
Okay, that's a famous recording by Big Brother and the Holding Company, Janis Joplin in the 60s.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
And R. Crumb, the great artist who now lives in
Yeah.
France, did the cover for that. So,
Oh, really? I'll have to check that out. I'll have to look for that
if
one.
you like the blues and Janis Joplin, check out Cheap Thrills.
Absolutely.
One of the things about jazz that's always fascinating is how people change over time. How do you think you've changed musically in your lifetime?
Well, I think I've relaxed a little. I was actually anticipating you asking me what I've learned from Miles musically, and by listening to that clip, I would say one of the main things I learned from him is the importance of leaving space. But you could not tell from that clip because I think I played the entire solo. But since then, I think as a result of just maturing and learning about yourself and things that happen in life, I've learned to breathe a little bit more. So I think there's just a maturity that comes in terms of being more comfortable in your own skin. So feeling safer to leave space, and also you get more familiar with your own style and vocabulary as a result of just working on it. So maybe when I was younger, the goal was maybe to try to sound like my idols, as opposed to now feeling like I've kind of developed something that is based on all of that stuff, but it feels more personal as a result of just working on it for the last 20, 25 years.
Yeah. So you've worked with Miles, you worked with Maynard Ferguson, you've recorded on your own for Blue Note Records, now you're in Paris, you've done a big band album, a quartet date, you're working consistently. Is there anything that you haven't done that you want to do in this music, Rick?
I would like to do an album with an orchestra. I've written a saxophone concerto, but it's a little bit more classically based. It's not like a jazz concerto. It's more classically based. But I would like to do a record. Of course, Charlie Parker with strings is one of my favorite all-time records. Also, Michael Brecker with Klaus Ogerman's called Cityscapes. That's one of my favorite records. So something that incorporates my music, but with an orchestra. Yeah. So Rick Margitza with strings.
Wow. Well, I hope you get the opportunity to do that. That'd be cool. We're gonna close out here with another track from Barcelona. Who's in the band on the quartet here?
This is a pianist from France. His name is Pierre de Bettman. The bass player's name is Daryl Hall. He's from the States, who also lives in France now. And the drummer is an Italian man who lives in Paris also. His name is Andrea Micheluti. And I guess this is the version of the classic Fats Waller tune called Jitterbug Waltz.
Yeah. Well, we want to thank Rick for joining us today from Paris. And everyone have a great weekend. And Monday, our guest will be Dave Liebman. Please take care.
Wow.